Good afternoon, and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergün Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at mythsandrealities.com. When the peace conference began meeting in Paris in January 1919, Armenian extremists thought their hour had arrived. They sent two delegations to the conference. One was led by Boghos Nubar, the Armenian National Delegation representing the diaspora, the other by Avetis Aharonian, representing the Republic of Armenia. The two delegations first outbid each other, then merged, and the joint Armenian delegation made wild territorial claims. They claimed not only the 6 vilayets of Van, Bitlis, Diyarbekir, Harput, Sivas, and Erzurum, where the Armenians had never in history been a majority, but also Trabzon, Karabagh, Zangezur, and large parts of Georgia and Cilicia. A vast patch of land stretching from sea to sea, from Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The problem was the Armenians would only constitute a small minority in those vast lands, less than 15%. Thus, Armenian demands boiled down to an apartheid. If the Allies gave those lands to the Armenians, the polity the Armenians create would be the first apartheid of the 20th century. Not that the Allies would. Boghos Nubar sent this letter to French Foreign Minister Stéphane Pichon, which was received in the French Foreign Office on December 3, 1918. The significance of this letter is that it sums up why the Ottomans, who were fighting for survival on 5 fronts while combating a persistent and widespread Armenian rebellion at home, had to move the traitorous Armenian population out of the war zones in defense of the Turkish homeland and people. Let's read that letter. I quote, "Monsieur Ministre, I have the honor, in the name of the Armenian National Delegation, of submitting to Your Excellency the following declaration, at the same time reminding him that the Armenians have been, since the beginning of the war, de facto belligerents, as you yourself have acknowledged, since they have fought alongside the Allies on all fronts, enduring heavy sacrifices and great suffering for the sake of their unshakable attachment to the cause of the Entente. In Palestine and Syria, where the Armenian volunteers, recruited by the National Delegation at the request of the French government, Republic of France itself, made up more than half of the French contingent and played a large role in the victory of General Allenby, as he himself and his French chiefs have officially declared. In the Caucasus, where, without mentioning the 150,000 Armenians in the Imperial Russian Army, more than 40,000 of Armenian volunteers contributed to the liberation of a portion of the Armenian vilayets, and where, under the command of their leaders, Antranik and Nazerbekoff, they alone, among the peoples of the Caucasus, offered resistance to the Turkish armies from the beginning of the Bolshevist withdrawal right up to the signing of an armistice." Unquote. Signed, Boghos Nubar Pasha, the head of an Armenian National Delegation at the Peace Conference in Paris. Unquote. As you can see, the Nubar Pasha clearly confesses that the Armenians had waged constant war with the Ottoman Empire from November 1st, 1914, right up to the signing of the Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, 1918, and had thus been de facto belligerents. And that's not all. Nubar writes another letter, this time for public consumption, and submits it to the Times of London, which faithfully publishes it on January 30th, 1919. This letter provides evidence on Armenian military support for the Allies during the First World War. In his letter to the Times of London, dated 30th, 1919, 30th January, Nubar openly acknowledges that it was the Armenian contributions to the Allied war effort that led to their mistreatment by the Ottoman authorities. Nubar's words articulate nothing less than a full confession involving Armenian armed rebellions, systematic violence against the Ottomans, and supreme treason. This letter should make anyone think twice before one concludes that the Armenians were innocent victims. Here is that letter, I quote, "To the editor of the Times, Sir, the name of Armenia is not on the list of the nations admitted to the peace conference. Our sorrow and our disappointment are deep beyond expression. Armenians naturally expected their demand for admission to the conference to be conceded. After all, they had done for the common cause. The unspeakable suffering and the dreadful losses that have befallen the Armenians by reasons of their faithfulness to the Allies are now fully known. But I must emphasize the fact, unhappily known to few, that ever since the beginning of the war, the Armenians fought by the side of the Allies on all fronts. Adding our losses in the field to the greater losses through massacres and deportations, we find that over 1 million out of a total Armenian population of 4.5 million have lost their lives in and through the war. Armenia's tribute to death is thus undoubtedly heavier in proportion than that of any other belligerent nation. For the Armenians have been belligerents de facto since they indignantly refused to side with Turkey. Our volunteers fought in the French Legion Entrangere and covered themselves with glory. In the Legion d'Orient, they numbered over 5,000 and made up more than half the French contingent in Syria and Palestine, which took part in the decisive victory of General Allenby. In the Caucasus, without mentioning the 150,000 Armenians in the Russian armies, about 50,000 Armenian volunteers under Antranik, Nazerbekoff, and others not only fought for 4 years for the cause of the Entente, but after the breakdown of Russia, they were the only forces in the Caucasus to resist the advance of the Turks, whom they held in check until the armistice was signed. Thus, they helped the British forces in Mesopotamia by hindering the Germano-Turks from sending their troops elsewhere. These services have been acknowledged by the Allied governments, as Lord Robert Cecil recognized in the House of Commons. In virtue of all of these considerations, the Armenian National Delegation asked that the Armenian nation should be recognized as a belligerent. Had the recognition been granted, we should now have been admitted ipso facto to the conference, to which even transatlantic states have found access, though having merely broken off diplomatic relations with Germany, without the least sacrifice on their part. At the moment, when the fate of Armenia is being decided at peace conference, it is my duty as the head of the national delegation, which has no tribute from which its voice can resound, to state again in the columns of Times the important part played by the Armenians in this frightful war. I wish strongly to urge that the Armenians, having of their own free will cast their lot with the champions of right and justice, the victory of the Allies over their common enemies has secured to them a right to independence. Signed, Boghos Nubar Pasha, the head of an Armenian National Delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, unquote. That's the letter that was published in London Times. Those 50,000 Armenian volunteers mentioned in the letter were obviously non-Russian. Otherwise, they would have been drafted into the Russian army. So those non-Russians had to have come from somewhere. Have you ever wondered where? Yes, you guessed it. They were the Ottoman-Armenians, who were supposed to be loyal, taking arms against their own government. Now, to justify that supreme Armenian treason, some Armenian writers claim that the Armenian men in the Ottoman army were disarmed, thrown into labor battalions, and then the Ottoman army began an organized plan of massacring most of the Armenian troops. This is a devious misrepresentation, as the facts overwhelmingly contradict such an assertion. Claire Price, an American journalist who witnessed and researched the matter, puts it this way in his book, The Rebirth of Turkey, published in New York in 1923. Claire Price says this, and I quote, "According to the terms of the Constitution of 1908, the government of Enver could indeed mobilize the Armenians as well as the Turks in age to be in the armed forces. But an armed Armenian opposition started immediately, notably in Zeytun. At the oriental border, the Armenians began to desert to pass to the Russian armies, and the government of Enver, doubtful of the loyalty of those that stayed, separated them from the fighting forces to allocate them to battalions of engineers. In April 1915, Lord Bryce and Friends of Armenia in London began to collect money to arm these deserters. One cannot claim that the Russians remained indifferent in front of the supplement of these volunteers. Finally, at the end of April, the Armenians seized Van, and having massacred the Turkish population, they delivered what remained of the city to the Russian army, unquote. Claire Price, the author, discloses that his book contains his own observations. he says he has never engaged in commercial, educational, or missionary work. His interest in the Near and Middle East began with a newspaper assignment and has continued with curiosity as its motive. As you can see, an independent, non-partisan observer effortlessly debunks the Armenian narrative. Nubar's reference to 4.5 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire before the World War I is an exaggeration, perhaps concocted to convince the Allies that there were plenty of Armenians to comfortably populate those vast Turkish lands the Armenians coveted. You can see the Armenian population numbers from various sources on the screen. The number of Armenians living within the Ottoman Empire was between 1 to 1.5 million, according to over half a dozen neutral sources. While most of those numbers are rough estimates, the Ottoman census figures are accurate as they were the basis for tax collections. Adding the population of Russian Armenia of about 1 million brings the total of Armenians before the World War I to about 2.5 million. Nubar's inflated Armenian casualty and population numbers, therefore, cannot be substantiated with non-partisan historical evidence. Armenian accounts of First World War are replete with exaggerated numbers for political reasons. Nubar also claimed 1 million Armenians survived. Now, if you do the math using the pre-war population numbers I just shared, you will see that 300,000 to 600,000 Armenians died. Even this number is proven inflated by the Turkish Historical Society's research based on police reports of the time, which I will cover in a future episode. This is a far cry from the false claim of 1.5 million Armenian dead. Whenever these facts are pointed out to the supporters of the official Armenian narrative, they are quick to resort to emotional exploitation by saying even one person dead is one too many, and charge their opponents with insensitivity. To this I respond with, where is your sensitivity towards the Muslim victims, mostly Turkish, who met their tragic ends at the hands of Armenian revolutionaries? Aren't Turks and other Muslims humans too? Nubar falsely claims over 1 million Armenians died out of an imagined population of 4.5 million. Nubar claimed elsewhere that only 1 million survived. This means Nubar has two sets of numbers. One for getting aid from the Allied countries by inflating the casualty numbers, and another for getting the vast lands from the Allied countries by inflating the population numbers. In other words, one set inflates the dead, another one the living. It is because of these unscholarly manipulations that Armenian sources are not considered reliable. If you find all this very confusing, welcome to the realm of Turkish-Armenian conflict. There is a scholarly book written by Professor Turkaya Ataev exposing many Armenian falsifications. Another interesting point is this. From the writing of this letter to the French foreign minister at the beginning of December 1918, to the writing to the Times of London in late January 1919, that is, in the space of 2 months, the number of Armenian volunteers shot up from 40,000 to 50,000. If you can appreciate this brazen play with numbers, then you can understand why the population and casualty numbers supplied by the Armenian and pro-Armenian sources cannot always be trusted. Now let's go to the letter sent by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the President of the Foreign Affairs Commission of the French Senate on December 28, 1920, where the French openly accused Nubar of lying. Here's a quote from page 277 of the book The Armenian File, written by Kamran Grün, published in Nicosia in 1983. I quote, "You have asked me whether in 1916 or since that date the French government had engaged itself in regard to Armenia to constitute an autonomous Cilicia. I have the honor of informing you that no engagement of this nature ever took place. There is no document of any kind which confirms the claim made by Boghos Nubar Pasha that Georges Picot assured him that France would create an autonomous Armenia after France conquers Cilicia," unquote. The fact that Nubar made unfounded claims is also verified by the British Prime Minister Lloyd George. In John Grigg's book, Lloyd George, From Peace to War, 1912 to 1916, where he described Nubar's explanations as, quote, fairy tales, unquote. This excerpt from the book, called A Myth of Terror, an illustrated expose by Eric Feigl, is enlightening. I quote, "Lloyd George, in his well-known flowery style, described Armenia as a land soaked with the blood of innocents. Little did he know that he was telling the truth, but that the blood was mostly that of Muslims, who in fact had many more dead to mourn than the Christian Armenians. Lloyd George was just as much a hypocrite as Wilson and Clemenceau," unquote. And this excerpt on page 15 of the book, The Tricolor Over the Taurus, reveals another misrepresentation by Nubar. I quote, "The Armenian delegation demanded independence for Cilicia. To this, the French delegate replied, in the name of France, that since a special form of administration had not been stipulated for Cilicia by the Treaty of Sèvres, it would be difficult to bestow sovereignty on this country. Nevertheless, the French government would do its best to protect the Armenian minority. Upon this, Boghos Nubar indicated that the Armenians in Cilicia were not a minority, but a majority," unquote. That is another falsehood. This excerpt from page 111 of the book, 1994 book, Le Général Henri Gourand au Liban et Syria, 1919-1923, written by Philippe Gourand, provides the sequence of violence in Cilicia. I quote, "The French Armenian Legion is unleashed upon the innocent Turkish populace in what the Allies referred to as Cilicia, and they commit the most unspeakable atrocities. Protests to the French fall upon deaf ears. At first, the Turks respond by conducting boycotts against Armenian businesses throughout Anatolia. In similar manner, Greek merchants were boycotted against once the Greeks landed in Izmir and began pushing into Anatolia from the west, committing their own atrocities against the Turkish people. The boycotts soon developed into widespread attack against returning Greeks and Armenians after initially being welcomed by Ottoman authorities, despite warnings by the Ottoman government that such attacks would only hurt the Turks at the Paris Peace Conference. Turks from Bitlis and elsewhere in the northeast began to assault caravans of returning Armenian refugees, seeking to enter from the Russian Caucasus. In turn, Armenian nationalists had no trouble convincing thousands of Armenians in central Anatolia to react to the boycotts and attacks by immigrating to Cilicia, especially since French High Commissioner in Syria, Georges Pichon, encouraged them to come and settle. The French army would provide the protection needed to establish an Armenian nation to supplant that of the Turks." Unquote. This statement by Ataturk on page 35 of the book Ottoman and Russian Documents on the Massacres Committed by the Armenians Against the Turks, edited by H.K. Turkozu, published in Ankara in 1982, is quite illuminating. I quote, "Armenians who are armed by the French forces who have occupied these southern areas are brought together under the protectorate of France. They are attacking the Muslims in their vicinity with a desire for extermination and are resorting to a merciless policy of murders and massacres. The Armenians who collaborated with the French forces of General Allenby razed to the ground an ancient Muslim city like Marash and tortured and slaughtered thousands of defenseless mothers and children. Armenians are responsible for this savagery unprecedented in history, and the Muslims fought against them and defended themselves to preserve their honor and lives." Unquote. In summary, Boghos Nubar's letters to the French in 1918 and the British in 1919 amount to a full confession of Armenian rebellions, treason, and atrocities victimizing Muslims, mostly Turks. Next week, I will expose another major Armenian confession, that of Hovhannes Kachaznouni, the first Prime Minister of Armenia. Thank you for joining me, and see you next week.